on the phone. Congressman, thanks for joining us this morning.
John, delighted to do it. Thank you for taking an interest in this issue. Thank you.
Well, what got you interested in this issue in the first place?
Well, John, it goes back a few years. I've been on the Armed Services Committee for 20 years, and I've developed relationships with the colonels and the majors in the liaison's office. And a few years ago, I had a colonel to tell me, he said, you know what really upsets us, and this is before the crises in our budget. He said of these overseas trips that are going to take members of Congress and sometimes their wives to these foreign countries for meetings, and we're spending money out of the DOD budget, Department of Defense budget, and it just seemed like to me that if they're going to take these trips paid for by the military, it ought to be disclosed so the American people can know what members are spending to go overseas and the money coming from the Department of Defense. That's the purpose of the bill.
Well, Congressman, we've had a couple questions from folks already in this segment. Essentially, do you think these overseas trips are useful for members of Congress?
Well, the way I look at it, John, to me personally, it depends on the trip. What type of trip is it? The way I look at this, my answer would be no. At this particular time in our nation's history, with so many budget cuts, and here we are spending this kind of money. If the member thinks it's worthwhile, let the member explain it to his voters, but also disclose the cost of the trip.
Hey, Congressman, talk about, do you travel overseas, and when you do, where do you go and why?
Well, this will really probably shock your viewers and listeners. I've only been on one overseas trip in 20 years, and that was to Panama for 2 days. That was the last trip I've made overseas, and that was in 1996, I think. I'm not opposed to these trips. I would not be opposed to anyone taking them, but there should always be sunshine when we're spending the taxpayers' money and taking the money from the Department of Defense.
And so, Congressman, your legislation focuses on the Department of Defense spending on these trips. What's the status of that legislation now?
Well, I'm very pleased that the Armed Services Committee in the House, we marked up and we passed our bill on the floor of the House about 3 months ago. So it's in the House bill. When the Senate gets to finishing their bill and then we go to conference, it's my hope that the Senate will agree with the House position because, again, this does not even challenge the trip. It just says if you're going to make the trip, make sure that all the expenses are shown to the taxpayer, including the military costs by the military having to use their planes.
And Congressman, we showed a clip earlier of Congresswoman Jackie Speer talking about per diems that members of Congress get when they go on these trips. Are you seeing that other members of Congress are starting to share your concern, or is it just a small group of members?
Well, I think most members of Congress in both parties really believe, as I believe, that the taxpayer has a right to know how we're spending their money. And particularly when we're hearing about cuts in the military, I mean, Secretary of Defense Hagel has said so many times that the military is threatened because of these budget cuts. Well, how can we take these trips overseas? And if you do think it's worthwhile, then show the cost of the trip. That's all it does. It's very simple.
Congressman Walter Jones is a Republican from North Carolina. Congressman, before I let you go, answer this question from Matt Smith on Twitter. He writes in, how could citizens conceivably control this? Should they ask Congress people to vote away their own perks?
Well, what they need to do, let's just use this language that's now passed the House. I would say to the gentleman, please call your senator and ask her or him to support the House position when they go to conference, probably sometime in the late fall.
Congressman, thanks so much for joining us this morning on the Washington Journal.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
We still got Philip Swartz in studio with us talking about this issue. Philip Swartz is the